In this video, we'll go through the process of classifying alcohols. Recall, alcohols are organic molecules that contain the hydroxyl or the OH functional group. That hydroxyl group is bonded to a specific carbon. However, depending on how that carbon atom is bonded to other carbon atoms, that indicates whether our alcohol is primary, secondary, or tertiary. So one thing before we get into that, let's take a trip back to 1151. You learned about Lewis dot symbols or electron dot symbols. So let's think about the oxygen. Oxygen has 6 valence electrons. So when looking at electron dot symbols, you use the dots to represent a valence electron. You have to pair one or place one on each side before you can go back and pair any. And so in oxygen, you'll end up with a total of 4 electrons that are paired up, and you have 2 electrons that are not paired. Those unpaired electrons indicate how many bonds that atom wants to form to be in its most stable form. And so in the case of oxygen, it wants to form 2 bonds in order to be in its most stable form. So keeping that in mind, when we think about alcohols, again, the alcohol has the hydroxyl functional group, so that OH group. When we see that OH group, that is the same thing as saying that this oxygen is bonded to that hydrogen. So writing out the OH is the same as the bond between the atom. And so that oxygen, we can see that it has 2 bonds around it. And remember, each bond contains 2 electrons. So it has 4 electrons that are in bonds. And then it has a total of 4 electrons that are non-bonding. And so keeping this in mind, when we look at an alcohol, that oxygen has to be bonded to that hydrogen in order to represent an alcohol. So therefore, it can only form 1 bond to a carbon. So when we're determining primary, secondary, or tertiary, we can't just look at how many carbon atoms are bonded to the oxygen, because it's always going to be bonded to only 1 carbon. Instead, we have to look at what's called the alcoholic carbon. So that carbon that is directly bonded to. So if we look at this very first one, so we have our alcohol functional group, that OH group. Identify the alcoholic carbon. So it is referred to that because this is the carbon where the hydroxyl, so the alcohol functional group, is directly bonded. Depending on how many carbon atoms are directly bonded to that alcoholic carbon, this is what determines the classification of the alcohol. So for the first alcohol, we have our alcoholic carbon, the carbon that the alcohol functional group is bonded to. It only has 1 carbon atom directly bonded to it. So therefore, this represents a primary alcohol, or you can see it indicated as a 1-degree alcohol. If we look at the next one, again, locate your hydroxyl or your alcohol functional group. Locate the carbon that it's bonded to. And so look at how many carbon atoms are directly bonded to that alcoholic carbon. So this carbon is directly bonded to the carbon to the left, directly bonded to the carbon to the right. It's directly bonded to 2 carbon atoms. So therefore, it represents a secondary alcohol. Secondary alcohols are designated by 2 degree. And then if we look at the last alcohol, again, identify and locate your functional group. Locate that alcoholic carbon, so the carbon that it's bonded to. Then determine how many carbon atoms are directly bonded to it. So it's directly bonded to this carbon, as well as that carbon. It's directly bonded to 3 carbon atoms, so it is referred to as a tertiary alcohol and designated as 3 degree. So when looking at alcohols, you want to locate your functional group, look at the carbon atom that it's directly bonded to, figure out how many carbon atoms are directly bonded to that alcoholic carbon, and use that to determine whether it is primary, secondary, or tertiary. Even if we had longer chain alcohols, so if I go and draw an alcohol that has a long chain, but my OH group is here, still the same process. Identify your functional group. This represents the alcoholic carbon because that's where that OH group is bonded to. That alcoholic carbon has this carbon directly attached, this carbon directly attached. So even though there are carbon atoms extending outside of that, we're looking at how many carbon are directly attached to the alcoholic carbon. So again, we have a secondary alcohol. So you can go through this process with other alcohols to classify them as primary, secondary, or tertiary.